Hey guys, this is 3B. We're going to look at the different cycles. You've already started to read about it a little bit, but we're going to go more in depth now. Like I said before, once we start talking about these cycles a little bit, they are free game for the rest of the year. And these are the ones that are the most technical information you're probably going to learn all year. So it's very important that you get a really firm understanding of how they work now, so that later on in the year when we bring them up again, you'll be very familiar with these cycles, right? So this isn't the last time we're going to see this. Not only are you going to be quizzed on it, but we're going to actually run tests on all these different nutrients that we're going to learn about here. All right. Hydrologic, so hydro is water, right? So just think water, right? Hydrologic, you're looking at the movement of water. Moves water through the biosphere. Okay, geochemical cycle, the movements of matter within and between ecosystems. So I had one of your classmates today was asking about one of the reading questions, and it's a good idea that you ask me questions about the reading questions. And if you and your group discuss these things, then come to me and ask the question as a group. You're probably doing the right thing, and you're discussing these things, right? So I would recommend that. But she was asking me about the difficulty of defining a system when we're studying environmental science because of the way energy flows in systems. And because water is not specific to just one location, it evaporates, as we're going to see in the next couple of graphics here. Because it has lots of ways of moving around, it's very hard to confine our scope, right? Do we want to zoom in really, really, really close? If we do, we miss out on all the stuff that might be outside of it that could be going into the system or going out of it. Or do we want to zoom out really, really far, but miss out on the stuff that might be happening at the micro level that's making it transfer out, right? So we need to kind of zoom in and zoom out. We need to have like snapshots in and out, right? So we can kind of understand how all these systems are interconnected, right? And that's really one of the difficult parts of defining systems in environmental science. Unless you're down in like a cave that's pretty much locked away from the outside world, it's really hard to study something just by itself. Here's the hydrologic cycle. So you should know about this already. I'm not going to read every single thing here, but these are some general things that you should know about that cause the movement of water. Obviously, things that are obvious: evaporation from heating, right? There's going to be some motion of water this way too, like convective currents, right? Because of this, like here. There's also going to be a little bit of water motion from the spin of the Earth, as you're going to learn about in the next couple of chapters. This idea of gyres and sulky, not gyres and sulky, gyres and sulky are in the brain. Gyres on Earth, they're like these surface water currents that go like this because of the spin of Earth. All right, so it's another thing kind of moves water around. But the more basic things, you got evaporation, you got transpiration, you got more evaporation, you got precipitation. This could also be snow. Snow would count as precipitation as well. Plants are going to pull water up from the ground. We pull water up through, what's that called? Wells and things like that. We're going to learn all about wells and what it does to water and all kinds of things like that. We're going to learn about fracking and what that does to water. But water also infiltrates through the ground and it percolates through the soil. Percolation means moving through a semi-permeable barrier. You should know that from chemistry. Okay, so that's hydrologic cycle. Fun. You should be able to draw and at least label probably 70% of these things. If you don't remember every single thing, it's probably okay. But let's say you know that it evaporates from soil. You're probably going to know it transpires from plants as well, right? All right. Transpiration, release of water from leaves during photosynthesis. Evotranspiration, combined amount of evaporation and transpiration. So this is like the total effect of the sun heating surfaces and plants sweating, basically. Okay, runoff, very important word right here, runoff. It moves across the land surface and into streams and rivers, and this is something that we use to study the health of an ecosystem sometimes. We look at the nutrients that are being added to watersheds, right? We're looking at water that's being added to ponds and lakes after some sort of disturbance, whether it be mankind or natural, right? So runoff can tell us a lot of things about the health of an ecosystem, or it can tell us about activities that are happening upstream, downstream, just right up the road, right? So this idea of runoff you are going to hear about all year. And you read a bit about runoff and how it's affected by pavements and hard surfaces when we were talking about Houston the other day. So it's always kind of good to think about these things in context, right? Think about these things in context. And you think, if you go back to the slide before and you think about how plants uptake water and they store it, trees are essentially gigantic pillars of water. And if you've ever tried to heat a gallon of water, it takes a pretty long time, right? So that kind of can tell you something about if you've ever gone out into the country and you notice that it's a lot cooler than it was just 10 minutes ago when you were in the city. And that's because you're essentially around a bunch of water. It's in the trees, it's in the grass, it's in the bushes and things like that. And it's really hard to boil and change the temperature of the air in that area. So that is one of the nice things about trees, other than the fact that it obviously shades you from solar radiation a little bit, right? The carbon cycle, the movement of carbon around the biosphere. We're going to look at this idea of, and it's kind of early in the year to talk about this, but I think it's good anyways. We're going to talk about the idea of fossil carbon and modern carbon. Okay, fossil versus modern. And kind of like this idea of how this is all part of like a budget. Because we do have like the idea of conservation of mass, which means, we're a closed system for the most part as a planet. So even though we have like a certain set amount of carbon overall, that does not mean that we are, we'll talk about it in a second. I'll talk about it in just a second. So here's the carbon cycle. In general, we have this idea that it gets up into the atmosphere through all these different processes. Fires will burn down trees, and since trees are made up of carbon, we know like the 6 most common elements that make up things on Earth. Carbon is one of them. So the trees will get burned, and guess what? It gets released in gaseous CO2. Decomposition creates a lot of CO2. That's in aerobic, okay? So this decomposition here, releasing CO2, this is assuming that these conditions are aerobic. If we have anaerobic respiration, we end up with this guy right here, CH4, methane. Methane is really, really bad. It is much more potent of a greenhouse gas than CO2. Far, far greater. 25 to 30 times greater. So that's something to keep in mind, right? Let me keep this right here. It's in there, okay? It's in there somewhere. All right. The ocean is a really big absorber of CO2 as well. It gets deposited onto the surface of the ocean, and it gets associated into the water. And you've seen this before if you ever open up a soda bottle. That's all those bubbles coming out is because you have decreased the pressure. So the heat energy that's around the bottle will be enough to boil out the CO2, which has a much lower specific heat and boiling temperature than just water in general. So it's going to boil out sooner. It's a gas. So, all right. So we're going to deposit CO2 into the ocean. And just think about what happens when you heat up the water, right? From lower and lower, you might have more evaporation of this stuff here, right? And we'll talk about some kind of weird things about like the ocean as as we get further into the year. But you have to see the ocean as kind of like a continuum of the atmosphere, right? So it's kind of weird. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, producers will absorb carbon, and they'll assimilate it into part of like their body, and it's converted into sugars, right, through photosynthesis. In respiration, it's put back into the atmosphere as CO2. Volcanoes are one of the original sources of CO2 in the atmosphere. If we didn't have active tectonic plates, we would not have CO2 formation in the atmosphere, and we'd end up very, very cold, right? We'd end up like Mars. Right now, we're trying to be more like Venus, though, where they have runaway greenhouse gas effect. So we got to be really careful with that. Before human beings were here, right? And there wasn't really another creature that I know of. Maybe there were some dinosaurs that became incredibly evolved and started extracting their own bones. I'm just kidding. Most fossil fuels are from plants, right? They're from old fossilized liquefied plants, not dinosaur bones, but it's from old plant material. But before humans in general, we didn't have a lot of this fossil fuel stuff taken out of the ground and burnt in combustion reactions. So the carbon that was cycling was all stuff that was above ground. It was all stuff that was above ground. And this above ground carbon in the form of just respiration of plant life, respiration of animal life, and then assimilation and photosynthesis and whatnot, deposition into like into the ocean, and then evaporation out. All that stuff was what I would like to call like an above ground budget. So it's the carbon that's just like cycling above ground, right? Not deep underground with this fossil fuel stuff. This above ground idea is what we call modern. And it's kind of weird because we're not talking about like, well, modern day, we're burning lots of CO2 through gas. Modern we're talking about is above ground stuff that's just always, it's been here for, in the recent past, it'll be here in the recent future. It's the stuff that we are allowed to play with, right? Now, this stuff down here underground is what we call a sink, right? It's a carbon sink because it is sinking this carbon literally into the ground, but a sink you can think of as like a storage. So the sink is a storage, right? And this stuff below, all down here, is what we call fossil carbon because it's like old or ancient carbon even, right? So this idea of ancient fossil carbon. If I could spell ancient correctly. Ancient, sure. Okay, so this ancient carbon down here is stuff that isn't typically played with in the entire history of the Earth, right? It just stays down here. Now, there can be some subduction where it gets put into like the mantle or whatever, and this can eventually come out in volcanic eruptions. But it's not something that's happening actively, right? Like all the time. Like we might move like 2 to 4 millimeters a year or something like that. So it's not happening on a regular basis. But human beings are doing it at a much more rapid rate than the Earth could do. And so we're taking this above ground modern carbon and we're adding old carbon sunk ancient carbon to it. So what's happening is this budget is getting more and more and more carbon to it, added to it as human beings, develop industry, as we become more affluent, and we get more access to vehicles. Just think, in the next 20 years, if China were to develop on the same, if China and India were to develop on the same path that we did, not really knowing too much about, living sustainably. Think about the number of internal combustion engines that use fossil fuel that would be put on the road, right? We're looking at 2.5, almost 3 billion people with cars, right? That's, if you're letting babies drive and stuff, right? So that's the carbon cycle. That's a little bit advanced in the year, but I think it's good to kind of be exposed to some of these ideas early. Okay, macronutrients, one of 6 key elements that organisms need in large amounts. This is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. You'll learn about these 3 quite a bit when we get into soil and agriculture. Okay, but in general, you need these 3 to grow plants. Okay, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and we're going to run tests for these all year. Calcium as well, but these are the 3 main ones for growing plants: magnesium and sulfur. And we put a lot of this in the air through burning coal and stuff like that. But it's also used as a protein in what's that called? Like cell growth. It's like a protein. Okay, limiting nutrient is something that is required for the growth of an organism, but is usually available in lower quantity than others. So it's like in chemistry, it was like the limiting reagent. It's the thing you were going to run out of first. Not necessarily the lowest available, but it's the one you're going to run out of first for whatever reason. Okay, and let's talk about the nitrogen cycle. This one is big. Okay, you need to know this one. Fixation of nitrogen, a process which some organisms convert nitrogen gas molecules directly into ammonia. Okay, and this is important because it's going to eventually get assimilated into their body, right? But first, it's going to be nitrified. So nitrification, the conversion of this ammonia into nitrite and then into nitrate. Okay, so you need to know like these steps. Okay, and then assimilation is it's incorporated into their tissues. And I'll show you a little acronym for this in a little. Okay, so in mineralization, the fungal and bacterial decomposers break down the organic matter found in dead bodies and waste products and convert it into inorganic compounds. So just think minerals are things like rocks, right? Things you can't really eat. They are inorganic compounds like rocks, right? And what do you need to do that? The bacteria. Okay, and a lot of the times there are plants that have evolved very closely to bacteria in the soil, and they have a symbiotic relationship. They will mineralize stuff into ammonium, like ammonium derivatives and nitrogen derivatives that will eventually be part of this nitrogen cycle, and it'll put it back out into the air. It'll cycle. It's all part of the cycle. Okay, ammonification, the process which fungal and bacterial decomposers break down the dead or the organic nitrogen found in dead bodies and waste products and convert it into inorganic ammonium, so NH4+. Okay, denitrification. Now we're going the opposite way. Conversion of nitrate into a series of steps into the gaseous nitrogen cycle, N2O, and eventually nitrogen gas, which is emitted into the atmosphere. Now, here, we were going towards assimilation, right? We're going towards this idea of incorporating it into plant tissues. And as we start getting into the denitrification, this is when it goes back up into the air as N2. Remember that it started out as N2 coming into a plant or some sort of creature. And in the end, it's also expelled as N2 gas, right? So that's what you need to know. The starting point and ending point are going to be N2. Okay, leaching, this idea of leaching is the transportation of dissolved molecules through the soil via groundwater. And later on, when we start talking about waste management, we're going to talk about this idea of this liquid called leachate. Leachate. So it is stuff that came out of the trash through liquids and it ran into groundwater, into soil. Here's the nitrogen cycle. Okay, so this is what you need right here. This is the cyanobacteria stuff. Here are some ways that we do this. So here's the nitrogen cycle for decomposers, consumers, producers, blah, 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 blah. Notice that it can be a closed loop here. But some of it will get out. Got ammonia. Ammonia turns into ammonium, nitrite, nitrate, and this is getting ready to be assimilated by some sort of plant or animal. See, so it goes here, and goes into the aquatic environment, goes to producers where it can get assimilated, right? Then it'll be mineralized and excreted, leachate. You get leachate here. So this cycle can go lots of different directions, but you should know at least one of these straight paths, okay? Probably the most important one to know to get the gist of how this will be tested on the AP exam would be to start here. So you have N2 gas coming in. Nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen is N2. Okay, so the start of the cycle is N2. And this guy's going to come down this way. I think if you just memorize this loop here, you're probably good, okay? So for tomorrow, I would know this because I'm going to ask you to know this pretty cold. All right, now here's the acronym I promised you. All right, it kind of sounds funny, but sometimes you guys sound a little bit funny. I don't judge you, right? All right, here it is. 2 words you need to know. It is, oh, that's red. It'd be nice if I didn't use red, right? Fix, nad, fixnad, and pan. Nope, not PP. And pan. Notice that I wrote the letters right below their equivalent. See, like that. So A below fix, N below N, A below P, A below A, D below N. And what do these all stand for? These all stand for the steps in the nitrogen cycle. So fix, guess what that is? That's nitrogen fixation, nitrogen fixation. And the product of nitrogen fixation is it's taking N2 gas and turning it into ammonium, right? Ammonium. Okay, then in nitrification, you're taking that ammonium, turning it into nitrates, nitrite, and then nitrates, right? So that's the N, different types of nitrates. Then in the A, you have assimilation, where it's turning into the part of the animal, right? Assimilation, so it's becoming part of the body, and that is proteins, right? The P is for proteins. Okay, then you have the second A, where you have ammonification, where it's getting ready to leave the body, right? Ammonia is like in your pee, right? Urea is what's that called? Like ammonium waste, right? So there's a better word for it, but there's ammonium type waste, right? All right, so this stuff down here is going to get turned into ammonium. So from the protein, it's broken down, and now it's ammonium. And then finally, denitrification is when it goes back into the atmosphere as nitrogen, N2 again. So no matter which way you like to memorize this, starts out here where N2 gets fixated into ammonium. Notice that this is just kind of backwards, right? Then it's going to go into nitrification, where it turns into the nitrates, like nitrate, nitrite. And then it's going to go into assimilation, where it gets turned into proteins. Then ammonification, where it gets turned back into ammonium, where it's getting ready to be excreted from the body. And then denitrification, when it goes back into the atmosphere, as N2. So you can kind of see and then down here, then back up, and then down here. So it's a zigzag line, right? All right, this is back out in atmosphere here, atmosphere down here, right? All right, phosphorus cycle. You need to know that phosphorus is not really water soluble, and that's that thing I showed you today because of the insoluble compounds here. Phosphates not really soluble. So guess what? They are a limiting factor. They are a very common limiting factor. So when we do have runoff from human activities such as fertilizing in farms and poop from chickens, chicken poop gives you lots of phosphorus. Okay, you need to know that chicken poop, turkey poop, chicken crap, chicken get the crap. Crap, I'm going to spell it with a Y. Chicken crap. Chicken and turkey, wonderful birds. Turkey, chicken, crap gives you lots of phosphorus, right? And when you get that into the water, you end up with algal or algal blooms, right? And that's when you fertilize them way too much, and then they turn really, really green water. And guess what? When that algae all dies, because it's eventually going to run out of oxygen, so like that algae dies, guess what? O2 goes way down. In fact, it's gone. So guess what? You end up with hypoxia, hypoxic, low oxygen. And guess what happens to all your little fishies? All your little fishies. I can't draw a fish. I can't draw a fish. All your little fishies, guess what happens to them? They dead. Dead. All of them die. Every single one of them. All right, it's a massacre. So that's one of the FRQs you're usually going to be asked. You're going to be asked something about runoff mixed with the nutrient cycle. So make sure you know that phosphorus is super important for that. Also, it can happen with nitrogen, but phosphorus is like the classic example. Here you go. So what are some other things that lead to phosphorus going in the water? Well, first off, phosphorus cycle. All of these cycles in some way can be related to the hydrologic cycle. So any way that water can move is a way that the other nutrients can move. Look at that, leaching again. Now we fertilize with phosphorus stuff, right? We even use pesticides that use phosphorus, like glyphosate, right? And it'll block some protein synthesis in the body. I think it's like a neurochemical blocker. I don't know. Doesn't matter right now. But you just need to know that the phosphorus can move in the water. A lot of our detergents will have phosphorus in them. This is important, right? So if they're asking for human sources of phosphorus leading to runoff and then algal blooms and stuff like that, where you end up with like lots of green crap in the water, and then eventually everything dies and it just turns into this death pool, right? That sounds like a really cool rock metal band, right? All right. So you need to know that weathering from rocks, because this is the way that it's typically going to get into the water. It's just like breaking down of these rocks right here. You're going to learn about these things called lichens and mosses and bacteria that break down rock. Worms will help break it down a little bit and process it into stuff that's smaller. But it's not water soluble, so the only way for this to really get in here is if there's runoff from humans. But naturally in nature it just breaks down in rocks, right? Okay. So just know that stuff here. Sulphur cycle. Here's sulfur stuff. What you need to know about sulfur is that we burn coal. Volcanoes have a little bit of it too. In fact, this stuff is really caustic to breathe. It's acidic. We get acid rain from it. H2SO4 is sulfuric acid. And this has all kinds of problem on any sort of... Who do you think is most affected by sulfuric acid? Yeah, that's right, anything that lives in the water. Because look, it all ends up back in the water. As long as it finds a grade, which means like a downhill, the water will find its way. It always finds a way. Okay, aquatic creatures are really, really messed up by acids, much more than humans, because guess why? They have to live in the stuff that precipitated it down, right? We can at least go inside. We can put an umbrella on, right? We can use an umbrella. Our skin acts as a natural buffer against a lot of acids and bases. But these guys have to live, breathe, drink in this crap that we do, right? So when we burn coal, one of the products is sulfur, right? It is important for proteins as well. Like there's some, it's part of the attachment of like proteins. But we put way too much of it in the air. This is a problem. All right, responses to disturbances. Let's talk about disturbances. Okay, resistance and resilience. We look at watershed studies to look at disturbances, and the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, very important. This, AKA, is, I call this rule, the make room for others. Make room rule. Okay, and you'll see what I mean by that in a second. Okay, so what is this idea of a disturbance? Okay, it's anything that results in the changes of the size or community composition, right? Resistance is how much a disturbance can affect flows of energy and matter in an ecosystem. So the less the energy change that happens after disturbance, the more resistant that must have been, right? Resilience, on the other hand, is, oh, you've already been jacked up by whatever it was, but it's the rate at which you can return. So make sure you know the difference between these two. Resilience is like the ability to come back from falling. Resistance is the ability to resist falling in the first place. So how hard it is to knock you down. This one is how easy it is to get back up, right? Does that make sense? How hard it is to get knocked down, how easy it is to get back up, okay? What is a watershed? All the land in a given landscape that drains to a particular stream, river, lake, or wetland. And remember this idea that we talked about when we were learning about Houston, this idea of grades. You know that water follows a grade. It's affected by gravity, right? Okay. So just keep those things in mind too. So here's a watershed. Notice you got like all this ability for water to kind of come down the grade, right? Into a river, and eventually this will go out to a large body of water. Intermediate disturbance hypothesis, the AKA make room for the little guy rule. Hypothesis that ecosystems experiencing intermediate levels, so not completely destroyed where you even rip out the soil and you're down to the bedrock, you're down to the parent rock for the soil. As long as you don't do something like that, you end up with more diversity after like a small forest fire or like a nice light storm that tears down a bunch of trees than one with just low disturbance, and we'll talk about why right now. Okay, so look here. If, let's say you had one type of tree, you had one type of tree in the entire forest. Now, what do trees do? Well, they're really tall sometimes, and what ends up happening is these trees, I'm just going to draw all over this real quick. These trees, let's say they're all tall. They'll have like a large canopy. Here's the sunlight, and guess what's going to happen? They're going to take up all the sunlight and not let any of the little guys down here get anything to grow, right? But let's say I come in. I didn't mean to erase all of them, but oh well. Let's say I come in now, and I take out just like 3 of them, right? So now there's a little bit less cover. And what's going to happen to the sunlight is, yeah, some of it's still going to get absorbed, but some of it's going to be able to get to the ground, right? And so now these other little guys here might be able to grow up. And like now I have more diversity here, right? Maybe these guys one day will do that, right? So now this is good because I'm going to be able to have more little animals and plants that like the red stuff move in here, and it might be better for the environment, right? So that's kind of cool. Whereas if I just have all of one type of tree, and maybe I have some sort of blue virus that comes in and it only likes green trees, guess what? Imagine if all of my trees had been these green trees. I would now have absolutely nothing. I would have absolutely nothing in the entire forest now, right? So it's important for a little disturbance every once in a while to come out and clear away some of the dominant big dog. So that way, if I have a medium disturbance, look what happens to my diversity over time. You need to know this graph. If I have too much, though, look, I got nobody, right? Here's snail diversity. Yeah. Cool. Fun. So read this little infographic about that. Cool. All right, hope that helped. Bye-bye.